Folks, Professor Chris Kugler here. I just note that I think in my last video I mentioned that I would only be making one more video to cover Romans 12 to 16, but actually I found out I have the space to break that up into two separate videos, and I think it's desirable that I do that, and so I'll have this video on Romans 12 and 13, and then another video on 14 to the end, 14 to 16. So here on Romans 12 to 13, I note that according to common divisions of the book, and I've said many, many times that those tend to be pretty artificial, even though sometimes they're necessary, practical, and helpful, folks will say Romans 1 to 11 is the real theological argument of the book, and beginning in Romans 12 following, basically what you're getting is practical, ethical, moral, ecclesiastical advice about how to live your own personal life of holiness in practical context with practical everyday issues and how to get along with other believers in the body of Christ, with some prophetic material in 15 and then in 16 with all of the kind of the basics of here are my travel plans and say hello to all of these people, give my greetings. There's a sense in which that's true. There's another sense in which to compartmentalize theology as the major issues of human sin and salvation and election and Israel and Gentiles and soteriology and Christology and all of that in 1 to 11, and to separate that out from the lived experience of believers both individually and corporately, and to call the former theology and the latter something else is an artificial compartmentalization. But anyway, just wanted to flag that up. What in Romans 12 is really worth mentioning? Surely a lot of things, but as has been my practice, I want to highlight things and emphasize things which I think it's possible you will not have had enough emphasis in relation to. But let's begin at the beginning of Romans 12 with this fantastic, famous opening to this chapter. I exhort you, brothers and sisters, on the basis of the compassions and mercies of God, present your bodies as holy and living sacrifices, well-pleasing to God, because this is your rational, reasonable worship. What does that mean? Paul says, I exhort you through God's own mercies and compassions. It's sacrificial language. Present as if you had a lamb, a bird, one of the sacrifices prescribed in the Old Testament, or indeed, if you were a pagan, one of the sacrifices characteristic of the pagan rituals there in Rome. Just in the same way you would present those to a priest, or you'd present those on an altar to a god. Take your entire human lived experience. Again, it's a living sacrifice. It's poured out, spilled out, holy. Offer that to God, and this will be rational worship. The language of logikein latrian, which is the Greek Paul uses here in this verse for rational worship, is also an expression which was not uncommon in philosophical literature for worship with the mind and the heart and a community, which did not involve actual animal sacrifices. So it's not improbable that Paul is alluding to that as well. And he wants you not to be schematized or squished into the shape, he says, of this present age, which is corrupt and broken, but to be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Be able to think differently, to think good thoughts, to be holistically a new human being, thinking in God's world, God's way. And then in 3 following, there's really a lot about the different gifts and how we ought to work together as one body of Christ, and that parallels, of course, 1 Corinthians 12. And then again in 9 following, there's all of this about let your love be genuine, abhor the evil, hold fast rather to the good. And then pursue, I love this, pursue Philadelphia, that is this brotherly love with one another. Yes, let's move on. Rejoice. I'm in 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, etc. And then he says, have a share in the needs of the saints, pursuing philoxenian, that is hospitality. I love 12:13 What does it mean to have a share in the needs of the saints? This language is, yes, it's spiritual in terms of pray with and be one with in heart and mind. The language of, sorry, I lost it here in my text. There it is. The language of koinonuntis, which means have a fellowship or a partnership or have a common good with, also certainly includes the very practical issues of life. Share your, if they need it, share your food, share your money, share your clothes. And then, of course, that is immediately confirmed with pursue hospitality. What's the relationship between have a share in the needs of people and pursue hospitality? Sometimes people may need basic things like a place to stay, food to eat, etc. And within the Christian community, pursue such things. Going down to the end of 12, I want to highlight a couple of things which will contextualize what's going on at the beginning of 13, 1 to 7. Paul says, if it's possible, so far as you're concerned, be at peace with all people. Of course, that implies that sometimes it won't be possible as far as you're concerned. The other person on the other end will simply make that an impossibility. But as far as you're concerned, try to be at peace with all people. Don't avenge yourselves. If somebody does you wrong, don't try on your own account to put that right, but give a place to wrath, he says. Very strong language. Whose wrath? It's ambiguous, but allow probably a reference to God's own oversight of the wrongdoings in the world and God's own ability to see and properly to deal with those. Let God take care of those that wrong do to you. You worry about forgiveness, mercy, love, etc. Now let's go a little bit into Romans 13. This, of course, is 13, 1 to 7, the famous passage on what Paul has to say about political powers. A couple of notes. Far too often in the history of Christian thought related to politics, politicians in power have held up Romans 13 and said, see, here you have it. I've been appointed by God, and so you have to do what I say. It's important to realize that the very inspired apostle that penned Romans 13, 1 following, was not infrequently in trouble with government, with both religious, social, governmental officials. So it's not the case that Paul would say, leaders have been appointed by God, and so everything they do is holy and right and just and in line with Jesus' purposes, and so never contradict them or what they say or want. Paul was quite ready not, as an example, to get involved in the ever-increasingly popular cult of the Caesars, where the reigning emperor was worshipped like a god. He would not have done that. Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. And so he knew that there were times when you would have a conflictual relationship with governmental leaders. Nevertheless, he wanted to emphasize as an overarching thing that God likes the universe to be ordered, and therefore the idea of structured, arranged governmental oversight is God's idea in principle, though he obviously wouldn't write off on every single instantiation of it. The idea of governmental oversight is God's idea. And Paul wants to emphasize throughout there that governmental authorities are answerable ultimately to God. This relates at the end of chapter 12 with, if you have an issue with somebody, you can't take private vengeance. Don't go beat them up, kill them, steal from them, whatever. That is the role of governmental oversight in principle, even though in operation it won't always work the way it needs to work. And Paul will say things about, yes, indeed, do pay taxes to whom taxes are owed, honor to whom honor is owed, tribute to whom tribute is owed, etc., etc., etc. What's all that about? Paul is not an anarchist, even though he would have plenty critical to say about almost every instantiation of structured government in the history of the world. He is in principle in favor of ordered governance. He is not an anarchist. Nor is Paul for opposing governmental structures for opposition's sake, simply to be a whiny, irritating, complaining, anti-structural, anti-establishment kind of person. No, Paul is not automatically like modern romantics and postmodernists opposed to establishment structures. So that's not necessarily a problem for him. Paul is for participating in some things of the state. And he also is concerned about wanting, praying, acting for the good of the state. Also calling the state out when it is explicitly out of line with the purposes of God. Okay, let's call an end to Romans 12 to 13 now. We'll pick up with the end of the letter in this next video, which likewise will be reasonably short.